Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. My name is Daniel Blank, and I am the Managing Director of Public Programs at the Foundation, where, among other roles, I lead this acclaimed author event series. As I've often said, this series is, to my mind, one of this city's great cultural treasures. By bringing authors together with readers, we create a space for very exciting conversations, and we make the literary world accessible to the Philadelphia community. Now, the Foundation works to expand the Free Library's programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. But as a nonprofit, we are reliant upon your support to achieve these goals. So please do consider donating using either the QR code on these handy bookmarks, which I hope you were handed as you walked into the auditorium this evening. You can also donate through our website, freelibrary.org. And we are very grateful for your donations. They really do keep this and other very important programming afloat. Before we do formal introductions, we're actually going to begin tonight's program with a 1984 short film by Agnès Varda to set the stage for the discussion. And with that very fine introduction, tonight we welcome Carrie Rickey, whose important and distinctive contributions to American film criticism have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Village Voice, and the Boston Herald. Most notably, she was a longtime film critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, holding that post from 1986 through 2011. The subject of tonight's discussion is Carrie's new book, A Complicated Passion, The Life and Work of Agnès Varda, which offers a brilliant glimpse into the life and work of the acclaimed and influential French filmmaker, whose extensive filmography included dozens of features and shorts at the time of her death in 2019. Near the end of the book's introduction, Carrie writes that the project aims to keep both Varda's work and her memory alive. With its meticulous account of Varda's life and long career, alongside its expert, nuanced discussion of her films, there can be no doubt that the book lives up to that promise. Joining Carrie for tonight's discussion is Gary Kramer, who writes about film for Salon, Philadelphia Gay News, and Senses of Cinema, among other publications. He is the author of Independent Queer Cinema, Reviews and Interviews, and the co-editor of Directory of World Cinema, Argentina, Volumes 1 and 2. He teaches short attention span cinema at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute and is the chair of Cinema Salon, a weekly film discussion group. And now, please join me in welcoming Carrie Rickey and Gary Kramer.
Thank you. Carrie, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to talk to you about it tonight. I'm not going to say Agnès. We're going to use Agnès tonight because I cannot speak French.
We apologize to all the francophones here, but Agnès is too hard for me to remember.
For me to say. So we just saw the short by Agnès. Tell us about your thoughts and why you chose this short as a introduction to people who may not know Agnès Varda.
I chose it because, one, it's short. Two, I think it's very, very funny. Three, I think it deals with a lot of her interest in looking at things we usually don't look at and looking at them hard and telling us how the past informs the present. I think of it as I think her interest in it is, like many of her movies, the difference between how men think and how women think. And I think the movie itself, which was commissioned for French TV, was commissioned as a part of a series on the nudity in art and architecture. And I think she saw the caryatids of Paris as a kind of really about gender inequality in architecture. And she saw that the atlases, the males, were robed, and they carried they were holding up the world, and you saw the strain in their face. But the women were just there, beautiful, draped like garlands over the building facade. But then she cuts to real women, working women, holding piles of things on their head and working hard but never getting the credit for it. And just for the fun of it, she has a male nude because men are never nude in movies. Women are. And I think her little short might also be about what she saw, the gender inequality in cinema. Men are big and strong, and women are there for their decorative value. So these are elements of many of her films. And she's very funny, and no one made movies like her.
Okay. No, thank you.
And I'd be really curious about your thoughts afterwards.
So you write early on in A Complicated Passion, I was moved to tears before I saw her films. Can you explain that and your first encounter with Varda, both as a filmmaker and as a person?
Okay, I was moved to tears even before I saw one of her films, because the first film of hers I saw, I think I say in the book I was 19. I was actually 18. I just didn't know how to count well. And my professor at the University of California, San Diego, was Manny Farber, and he had a class called A Hard Look at the Movies. And he introduced a movie called Cléo from 5 to 7 as, I misheard him, he said, I thought Agnès Varda, a still photographer, had made this movie. And then the credits came up, and I saw, in French, it said, un film de Agnès Varda, and I realized, oh my God, a woman made a movie? I didn't know women made movies. Is that real? How long has this been going on? And the movie was about a woman who goes from a very decorative woman who's a pop singer. She's waiting for her cancer biopsy, and over the course of 5 to 7, which seems to take place in real time, she goes from a flibbertigibbet and a self-involved flibbertigibbet to a woman who wants to engage the world and get outside herself and learn about other people. And over the course of this movie, she goes from narcissism to empathy, and I cried again. It was very, very moving, and I never had seen a movie by a woman before, and it struck me differently than movies of the early 70s when I saw it.
So what about meeting her for the first time as a person, or in person rather? What was that like when you got to spend some time with her and talk to her? Because she's incredibly vivacious.
She is vivacious. She is. She had her own power, as they used to say in feminist circles. She was very absolute. As her son said, she could make you think the glass was full when it was empty. Mm-hmm. And she was very certain, and I was seated next to her at a luncheon held during the Cannes Film Festival. And we were seated next to each other, I assume, because we were the only two women there. And she looked at me, and she put her very small hand on her hip. She was one of those 5-foot giants, And she said, oh, I thought they were going to give me the New York Times. I see they gave me the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I was like, do I walk out? Do I punch her? Do I just grit my teeth and smile? I didn't want to cause any international incidents. And then she said something that surprised me. She said, spell your last name. And I did. And apparently she had read an article of mine in Art in America about the Los Angeles muralists. And she'd made a movie about the Los Angeles muralists. And she said, oh, that article was utile, very useful. Thank you. and then we became friends and talked for 2 hours straight.
So what was it about Varda and her work that spoke to you? I mean, you talked a little bit about this in your previous answer with seeing Cléo from 5 to 7, but there's a je ne sais quoi about Agnès.
I think she's always trying to provoke us, and she's always trying to be a little bit mysterious. I think some of her movies, not all of them, are like puzzles where we have to furnish the last piece that will hold everything together. Despite the fact that she made movies that were not in the Hollywood model, they're very accessible and they're very moving. And they talk about real issues like marriage and cancer, and if any of you here have seen a movie called Vagabond, she's dealing. She worked best as almost a journalist. She liked investigating a subject, and when she, in the 80s, she was reading these articles in the French press about the new poor, about all these young people who didn't want to go to college, who just wanted to hitchhike and drink and smoke dope and not be disciplined. And she read that and she said, I wonder what that's like, and she went to explore it. And a lot of her movies are pitched at the real world. They have documentary elements, but there might be a fictional story embedded in them. And I think it was Martin Scorsese who said her movies are just, pitched on the tightrope between the real and the fictional. And they're just very fascinating, and at certain times in her life she was very underknown, but she is the woman who initiated or started the French New Wave, which was the French film of the late 50s and 60s that replaced the kind of stuffy historical novel French costume movie that was in very popular before World War II. And the directors of the French New Wave were not unlike the Impressionist painters. They wanted to get out in the real world, not make stage sets, not spend a lot of money, but make movies. They wanted to make movies about real people, and not heroes and queens and kings and revolutions. They wanted to make movies about what was happening at the moment with the kind of people who you might live next door to. And in her wake came Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, but she got there first and was almost instantly named the grandmother of the New Wave, even though she was the same age as most of them and 10 years younger than Alain Resnais.
Well, she engenders a trust and an empathy with people, and that's how she gets her documentary film subjects to discuss their lives. And you talk about this in the book. You know, she made this film, Daguerreotypes, about the people who owned businesses on the street where she lived in France, in Paris. Can you talk about that? Because I think you say that she's reflecting reality. I mean, a lot of her films do play with documentary style, but she also makes fictional films, or she adds fictional elements to documentary. That's, I think, what's so interesting about her work, is that you sort of go on this ride, and she shows you these pockets of life that you wouldn't see otherwise.
She was, despite her behavior at the luncheon where I met her, she really knew how to talk to people at where they were, and elicit answers from them. And it got even better when she ditched the big cameras that she worked with and was hiding behind a 35 millimeter camera or a 16 millimeter camera. She was one of the first major directors who embraced digital photography, digital cinema. And when she had this 2-pound film camera, she could get really close to them, and she wasn't hiding her face. She could ask them questions and get closer to them and kind of create a bridge of trust. They liked her. They liked the questions she asked. They liked that she took interest in their lives and seemed to really listen. And she didn't have to go on listening tours. She was a listener. And she remembered a lot of encounters, and like many artists, would, take notes, put them in her movies, and she was inspired and inflamed by the real. And her movies just seemed to me to have fresh air, and they weren't,
They're not stuffy.
the people were real, and the situations were not stale. And she was, I think at one time she very much wanted to make a Hollywood movie. She was offered by Columbia Pictures the opportunity to make a movie in 1969 called Peace and Love. But when the head of the studio told her that the studio wanted final cut, in France, that's all directors are given that it's a given. And she said, I demand final cut. And the guy said no. And then to appease her, he pinched her cheek, and she slapped him, and there was no contract after that.
So why do you describe her passions as complicated? What is complicated about Agnès?
Well, at this first lunch I had with her, she was talking about her husband, who was Jacques Demy. You may have seen his most famous movie, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. You may have seen one of the most famous movies ever made in France called The Donkey Skin, based on the fairy tale about the king whose wife dies and he wants to marry his daughter. He wants to replace his late wife with their daughter. And he was a very beloved filmmaker. And I met her in 1988, and she was talking about her husband, Jacques, and I looked at her because I knew that he had been living in Los Angeles for many years. I'm from Los Angeles, and I used to visit my parents often, and I would see Jacques Demy and his male partner at the movies all the time, because he and I apparently like the same movies. And I said, forgive me, and yes, I thought, see, I'm doing it correctly now. Forgive me, but I thought you guys had separated. And she said, And she said, our partnership is something of a complicated passion. And then she paused, and then she said, I guess directing movies is like that too. And
It's a great quote.
I wanted her to name the book.
Okay. Well, I was going to talk about Jacques Demy later, but I'll go to it now since you brought him up. Varda is very practical, where her husband is a dreamer, and you write that in the book. You write about their marriage and their films, and they both have same-sex attractions. What are your thoughts on their relationships? I was tickled that his lover was Gerald Ayres, who wrote Rich and Famous, which is one of our favorite trashy movies. But how did their relationships? I mean, she had a very different career than he did. I see them, Demi is the hare and Varda is the tortoise, because he escalated to fame right away, and she had to develop well over the course of her career.
When they met, of course, at a film festival, because European film directors go to film festivals to make sure their movies are seen in other countries. And I mean, the Hollywood model of films was from the first very commercial. And it mattered how a movie did commercially in the United States. In France, movies were from the first an artistic expression. They were considered as an art, and she actually was more established when they first met at a festival of shorts. and they moved in together, and a couple years later got married, not because they wanted to be married necessarily, but because they liked taking vacations together, and they couldn't sleep in the same room unless they showed they were married. So, their relationship, their daughter Rosalie used to say, who worked for both her parents in professional capacities. She was a costumer and worked with Jacques Demy several times, and she later produced movies for her mother. And she said, with Jacques, everything was written out to the letter, and when you were on day one of the set, you already knew what was going to happen. There was no surprises. But she said, working with my mother, it was like diving into a swimming pool and not knowing what you were going to do next, because Varda, who began as a still photographer, like many still photographers, knew how to capitalize on happy accidents, and would not go with the script. And she came to realize that she really didn't want a script. She wanted things to be more realistic and lifelike and not canned. And her instincts, I think her best movies, she made a lot of documentaries in the 50s, and she started making almost strictly documentaries from like 2000 to her death in 2019. Her best movies were journalistic, researched, held together with her voice, which is very sensuous and smoky. And she kind of created, this hybrid movie, a documentary that could be funny at times, serious at other times, and all her own. And it was like her voice. It was very suggestive, and made you think of things you hadn't thought of, make you see things you didn't know about. And her movies were, like The Gleaners and I, which is one of the first movies about waste, food waste, and industrial waste, and really encouraged recycling and redistribution of food and wealth. It was very, very unusual, and won her a whole new generation of followers. They were just
magic.
Unlike anything you've ever seen, and they traveled around the world and were hugely successful. I mean, the older she got and the more she made movies, the more successful she was. Mm-hmm. She found her style.
Yeah. But yeah, she moves from the margins to the mainstream, and she was ahead of her time, but she was sort of late to be recognized. And that's why, I'm grateful that you wrote the book to give her full due, because, I've been a fan since Vagabond, and it's great to see this come to fruition.
Well, many Americans don't even know her early movies. I was surprised by, I thought I knew her work really well, and there's like 10 things I never saw because they didn't cross the Atlantic. And
Criterion Channel.
Pardon me?
Criterion Channel.
Well, now we know about Criterion, and Criterion did a wonderful box set that include almost all of her movies and all of her shorts. And in France, the film short is taken really seriously, unlike here, where the film short was usually Warner Brothers cartoons. And now Disney animated cartoons, but
you don't have to tell me about shorts. I love shorts. I teach shorts.
Well, this guy runs a very, very famous series at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute called Short Attention Span Cinema, and it's very funny. It's students tell me.
Yes, I will. Okay. Anyway, but let's go back to the book. I was very surprised by her friendship with Jim Morrison and Harrison Ford. I never would have associated either of them with Varda, but she's magic, and she absolutely would be friends with them. What can you say about her coterie of friends?
Well, this is imagine this Varda was very active in the reproductive rights movement and abortion rights movement in France. One of her partners in activism was Simone de Beauvoir, so she was very friendly with Simone de Beauvoir. She made a movie about Huey Newton when she lived in the United States with her husband called Black Panther. She directed one of Harrison Ford's first screen tests, and they remained friends. A former UCLA film student who rose to fame as the frontman for the rock group The Doors, Jim Morrison, was a huge fan of hers and befriended her. I mean, she knew everyone. She knew everyone everywhere. And she was just, in part, she was a fangirl of a lot of great directors like Bertolucci and Fellini. But in part, a lot of people were fanboys and fangirls of hers, and she introduced everyone to everyone. And I mean, there used to be, Truman Capote used to have this game called the International Daisy Chain. It's kind of like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, but sexual, you know. And Varda knew everyone. Anyone who knew Varda, there was only 2 degrees of separation in her life. And part of the fun of her writing about her is she really knew everyone, in every country, not just France, not just the United States, but people. She had a gift for friendship, shall we say?
So, what surprised you most about Varda in your research? What didn't you expect?
Well, while I was at the Inquirer, I wrote a lot of obituaries of show people, actors and directors, and I always approached their lives as trying to kind of project a 3-act structure on telling their life story. And to my surprise, I have to say, Cary Grant and most movie stars do not have 3 acts in their lives like that. They just don't. So, but you try to figure one out so the shape is more shapely. But Varda really had 3 acts to her life that are really clear, and they're all related to her work. She was Belgian, and her family moved to France during World War II, and she really, really loved French art, and she really wanted to make art herself. And when she passed her baccalaureate, which is like passing your SATs, in effect, although harder, her mother bought a camera for her, a Rolleiflex, and her mother bought it from a man at a photographer of a detective magazine who used it to take pictures of real crimes in France. And so Varda inherited this camera, and when she at one point wanted to be a curator, she at another point wanted to be a painter, and she decided she dropped out of the school of the Louvre. She decided to go to the Sorbonne briefly just to audit classes because she didn't like getting grades. She didn't like taking tests, like so many of us. And she decided to be a photographer, which in France has to be certified. You need your certificate. So she went to the School of Photography and Cinema in Paris and did a 2-year program in 1 year. And she became a photographer for the National Theatre of France and started taking pictures of very famous actors like Gerard Philippe, who we love, like Jean Moreau. And when she was taking, she didn't want to take photographs of them in rehearsal or on stage. She had to she wanted to imagine the content of the image. That she wanted the image she used for, publicity to give you the sense of what the play was about. And her photographs are amazing, but she didn't start with the theater. She started with taking pictures of kids on Santa's lap at department stores. And she got so expert, she didn't need a light meter. She could just, she knew if she put a cigarette in her mouth, about 2 minutes into it, the light would be right to take the image. She was very intuitive, and it was her second nature to take photographs. And so she kind of mastered the still image. But then she went from still images to, she wanted to make a motion picture, not because she'd seen many movies. She claimed that she'd only seen 10 or 15 before she made one. But she made a movie because a very good friend's husband was dying of cancer, and she wanted to give him an activity that could take his mind off his diagnosis. And as she was scouting locations in the south of France, in this town called Sète, where she spent much of her time, she decided to write a story about a married couple in crisis, which were her friends, set against the backdrop of this fishing village that was also in trouble because the water was polluted and they weren't permitted by the health department to sell the fish they were catching. And it's an amazing movie with amazing imagery, but she shot 10,000 feet. She basically shot 10 hours of footage without knowing how to make a movie. She didn't know how to match shots or keep consistent lighting or the grammar of films, doing a master shot and then a closer shot and then a close-up. She had no idea how a movie was put together. But fortunately, someone told her to look up Alain Resnais, who would later become a very famous filmmaker of Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and Stavisky, and a lot of movies likely many of you have seen. And he basically taught her what editing was about and how films needed to be put together. And he taught her, but she was also something of an autodidact. Once she knew that what she was doing was not exactly how other people did it. She took what she needed from that advice, and she learned about how to edit a movie and how to tell a story differently. And still, her stories were different from everyone else. And someone who really, really liked her first movie, which is called La Pointe Courte, said, this movie was very avant-garde, not because she was trying to be avant-garde, but because that's how she thought movies were put together. And
let's talk, because they're going to give me a signal here.
Oh.
She participated in the women's movement, and that got her to think about female representation on screen. She's quoted in your book as saying, "I'm not interested in how men and women see differently, but how false images of women are seen." She pays it forward to female filmmakers. I want to talk about your observations about her work, which was feminist, and her activism, because that's very much a part of her character.
Well, one thing she did before any other female filmmaker in France was hire a lot of women as her assistants. She hired women as composers, as editors, as gophers. And a lot of the women that she hired, as Resnais had taught her editing, she taught them a lot of other things. And among the people she helped were, women who later became directors, like Lynn Littman, who would win Oscars for her documentaries. And Littman made a movie called Testament, anti-nukes movie that was very popular about 35 years ago. And in France, Patricia Mazouy, and she would help Chantal Akerman, the Belgian turned Parisian filmmaker. And a lot of these women, you know, she was able to help these women join guilds and make more movies and increase the number of women who were seeing differently than their male peers. And what was the rest of that question?
Well, it was basically about how you know, her feminist outlook and how she was making films, you know, and being influenced by the women's movement in her films.
Yeah,
I mean, you know,
well,
one sings, the other doesn't is the film that comes to mind. You know.
Yeah, that might be my least favorite movie of hers, but I don't want to go into that. I mean, it's a very timely movie, but I think sometimes things that are so much of their own time that they die with their time. It's a movie about how the women's movement helped educate a lot of women and make them see social arrangements and motherhood differently. You know, and not, you didn't have to be married. You didn't have to. You could work outside the home, and she always believed this from the very first.
Well, I mean, and she tells stories of voices that are rarely heard. I think that's one of the things about her films that are so unique, is that she's giving voice to people who don't have one.
Right, especially in a movie like Vagabond, which is one of her more famous movies. When she started reading stories about the new poor in France, she immediately wanted to go to these cities in southern France where these hitchhikers and vagabonds had their, you know, were living and sometimes disrupting these small towns. And I'm suddenly thought of Springfield, Ohio. I'm sorry, I just, my mind just wandered. Although Agnès would never have eaten a cat, she loved cats.
But she was a cat whisperer.
Pardon me?
She
was a cat whisperer, and I believe she was the first person to make a cat video.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we owe her a lot just for that.
Yeah.
But she wanted to make movies about women who weren't correct and weren't the kind of women that her male filmmaker friends were making movies about. You know, the movies of people like Godard and Truffaut were about, if there was women in the movies, they were beautiful or they were treacherous. And that's not how Varda saw her female characters.
Yeah. Okay, I have one more question before we open it up to the audience. Varda says her goal was to get to the essence of cinema. What for you is the essence of Varda?
She was always curious. She had no formula for a movie. Every movie, a lot of her movies started as one thing and then became another. For instance, Vagabond, although it ended up being about a female drifter, started out as a movie about plane tree disease. But when she went to explore that in the South, that's where she was reading things about the new poor, and that's when she saw these female hitchhikers who seemed to be fearless and were going from village to village, town to town, and sometimes working, sometimes living off men, and having a kind of freedom that she had never seen women enjoy before. But everything about her films and her life was always a work in progress. And nothing was canned, and she never repeated herself, really. And the interesting thing is she always adapted. She would, once she got her first computer, she thought she was going to basically copy all of her films and put them on the computer, so she had a digital database of images that she could use. So she recycled stuff from her old movies, and she always had her own movies. Another thing she did that was so important, she saw so many female filmmakers who had been very active in the early days of cinema and were essentially erased. She realized that these women did not own their own movies, and so she really had all, she decided to buy back all of her movies from the producers who own them. She preserved them. She has them so she could make the money and she could make the financial decisions about how they got distributed. And that was very unusual. And she was a really good businesswoman. I mean, a lot of distributors told me she was the only director who knew how to read a royalty report. And she was always saying, no, you're wrong here. And she always, saw the mistakes. And no one she fought for everything. And she was, at the end, she was, her own producer, her own writer, her own distributor. Yeah. And it's kind of amazing. And she controlled the means and everything of production and distribution.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to open up for questions. Does anybody have any questions for Carrie about Agnès? I see a hand over there. Someone's going to come to you with a mic, and that way we won't have to repeat the question.
Thank you very much, both of you. And Carrie, I wanted to ask you, just on that note of her controlling everything, is there anything in your book that you think Agnès would be like, wished that she had, final cut over?
Well, yeah, the book. She liked control. And she, like many people, she created a public story, and she didn't always tell a full story about herself. And but finding out about things that she didn't talk about, I don't think she would be embarrassed by some of them now. She kept her bisexuality very guarded, and she always talked about her blissful relationship with Jacques, which had periods of notable unblissfulness.
Mm-hmm. All right, other question? I see a hand here.
Yes.
Am I supposed to stand? Is that what they were doing?
Sit, stand, whatever's comfortable.
Hi. Thank you for being here, first of all, I guess. And then a question I had was, it really struck me, that line about her saying that she had only seen like 10 or 15 movies before making one. And something I think a lot about as a young artist of sorts is like how there's so many more things that have already been done, and it's like, harder to be original. And I find myself like almost jealous of people from a past time that had like more open avenues, I guess. And if she ever kind of spoke about like regretting or like really enjoying that like aspect of not having seen previous things, and like as she got older and more friends with other artists, like if she kind of ditched that mindset and like really learned to embrace looking at other people's work and building off of that in her mind.
She spent a lot of time during the last 10 years of her life, I mean the period of from 80 to 90, going around the world really, including Philadelphia, teaching master classes. And I saw one that she had at the Scribe Video in West Philadelphia. And she was great. There was like maybe 75 people there, aged like 14 to 80. And she said, don't worry about your equipment. Just don't, what you need is an idea, a point of view, and if you can't get access to equipment, use your phone. and learn how to tell a story that way. She was very, really supportive. She loved looking at student work. She loved giving feedback. I mean, she was all about the work, I think. She loved her kids. She loved her late husband, who predeceased her by about 30 years or so. But she really loved work. And, you know, I think her only vices were a French treat called a chouette and cinema, you know. She didn't drink. She did a lot of her own cooking. Another vice. One of her favorite TV shows was Columbo. She liked curling up with her cat and watching Peter Falk. Who doesn't?
But she was an artist and a gallerist, too. I mean, she made a lot of installations.
Yes, I mean, I didn't talk about the third part of her life, which was starting in 2003, she went from still photography to moving pictures to dimensional work. She would make installations for museums and galleries, and they were wonderful, and they sometimes contrasted still images with moving images with real. You know, it was always about the real and the fake, the representational and the actual. And her installations are just charged with these opposites and tension, and they're really delightful. And she took her old analog movie reels, and she made like greenhouses, or she called them shacks, cinema shacks. And for one of her movies that was received very poorly, she called it My Shack of Shame. It was a movie called La Créature, and she used cinema, you know, lengths of cinema as one would use wood in framing out a house, and they're wonderful, and she always situated them where light was coming in so you could see the movie frames, and then sometimes she would decorate the inside of the shacks. But her artworks were amazing, and she always came to a new medium by figuring it out from inside out and sometimes reinventing it. And they're always really exciting. So I don't think she regretted anything. I think she just invented. She found different perspectives for her movies. She wasn't exactly like Ridley Scott, who was all about you know, big epics. She worked big, she worked small, she worked short, long, everywhere. She worked in real space. She was experimental her whole career, but she almost always, except for the movie that was a real failure, a sci-fi movie called La Créature, she always worked from real life.
All right, unfortunately, we have to finish. One more question?
I'm afraid we're at time just now, but
But you could ask me at the signing or as I get off.
yes, that is a great reminder that there will be copies of Carrie's terrific book available upstairs in the lobby, and she has very kindly agreed to sign them. That marks the end of tonight's program, but before we wrap things up, could we have one big round of applause for our speakers?